The wedding dress still hung in the hollow oak when hunters found it 3 seasons later, riddled with bullet holes and stained brown with what wasn't mountain mud. Sarah Ellen Combs had been walking to her own ceremony when the shooting started, her white lace catching autumn light between the ridges. By sunset, 9 people lay dead in Pineville Creek, and 2 families had declared a war that would consume 4 generations. The Hatfields and McCoys get the history books, but they were just the loudest voices in a symphony of violence that echoed through every holler from Pike County to the Tug Fork. While newspapers wrote about feuding hillbillies, the real wars stayed hidden in places where surnames were death sentences and children learned to shoot before they could spell their own names. Some grudges began over stolen hogs or boundary disputes. Others started with a glance, a slight, a woman choosing the wrong man. All of them ended the same way, with blood soaked into mountain soil and memories passed down like poison. Morning mist clung to the ridgelines above Devil's Creek as Samuel Combs checked his rifle for the 3rd time, the metal cold against fingers that hadn't stopped trembling since dawn. October air carried the smell of wood smoke and dying leaves, while somewhere in the distance, a mourning dove called through timber that had witnessed too many burials. He could hear his grandfather's voice echoing across 40 years. A Combs don't let insult pass. A Combs don't forget. A Combs settles his debts. The year was 1879, and the mountains of eastern Kentucky operated under laws older than any courthouse. Here, among families who had carved homesteads from wilderness and defended them against Cherokee raids, Confederate conscription officers, and federal revenue agents, justice moved at the speed of a trigger pull. Men carried their honor like loaded weapons, ready to fire at the smallest provocation. Samuel's family had been feuding with the Tolliver clan for 3 years, ever since his cousin Jacob had been found face down in Sourwood Branch with a bullet between his shoulder blades. The killing had followed the pattern that governed mountain justice: an eye for an eye, blood for blood, with interest compounding across generations like a debt that could never be fully paid. The Appalachian feuds began long before the Civil War, rooted in Scots-Irish traditions of clan warfare and the isolation that allowed Old World vengeance to flourish in New World hollers. These weren't random acts of violence, but carefully orchestrated campaigns that followed unwritten rules as complex as any military manual. A family wronged had the right to seek satisfaction. A family threatened had the duty to defend itself. And once blood was spilled, the cycle became as inevitable as winter following autumn. Samuel adjusted his position behind the fallen chestnut log, eyes fixed on the path where Elijah Tolliver would pass on his way to the grist mill. 3 generations of Combs men had died at Tolliver hands. Today, the debt came due. The sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and revealing a landscape scarred by more than just strip mining and clear-cutting. Every ridge held stories of ambush and retribution. Every creek had carried away evidence of midnight justice, and every family cemetery contained graves marked only with initials, their occupants too dangerous to name even in death. The shot that shattered the morning silence on October 15th, 1879, was meant to end a feud. Instead, it started a war that would consume both families for the next 20 years. Samuel Combs had aimed for center mass, the way his grandfather taught him, but Elijah Tolliver had stumbled on a tree root at precisely the wrong moment. The bullet meant for his heart took off the top of his skull instead, painting the mill wheel with blood and brain matter that would stain the wood for seasons to come. By noon, every Tolliver within riding distance had heard the news. By sunset, They had surrounded the Combs homestead like wolves circling wounded prey. The siege lasted 3 days, with shots exchanged across the narrow valley whenever someone showed themselves long enough to provide a target. On the third night, Samuel's younger brother Thomas tried to slip out through the cornfield to fetch help from their cousins over on Rockhouse Creek. They found his body the next morning, stuck full of arrows like a porcupine. "Indians don't use arrows no more," Samuel's wife Martha said, cradling their infant son while rifle fire cracked through the cabin's chinking. "That's Tolliver's sending a message." The message was clear. This wouldn't end with one death for one death. This was something larger, hungrier, a beast that fed on blood and grew stronger with each feeding. By winter, 12 people were dead, and the killing had spread to include the Walker family on Devil's Creek, who had the misfortune of being related to the Tollivers by marriage, and the Hatfield clan up in Logan County, who owed the Combs a favor dating back to the war. Between 1879 and 1885, the mountains of eastern Kentucky became a battlefield where families waged campaigns as organized as anything General Lee had managed at Gettysburg. They established supply lines, recruited allies, and developed intelligence networks that reached across county lines. A man might be bushwhacked in Pike County for something his cousin had done in Floyd County 3 years earlier. Women and children became targets when the men proved too well defended, and local law enforcement either looked the other way or picked sides based on which family controlled the most votes come election day. The violence followed patterns that anthropologists would later recognize as classic clan warfare, complete with ritualized challenges, symbolic displays of power, and elaborate codes governing when and how revenge could be taken. But to the families living through it, there was nothing academic about the daily fear that pervaded every aspect of life in the hollers. By 1882, Sarah Ellen Combs was 12 years old and could field strip a Winchester rifle blindfolded, identify the sound of approaching riders by their horses' gaits, and kill a man at 50 yards without flinching. She had been 7 when the feuding started, and could barely remember a time when her family didn't sleep with loaded weapons within arm's reach. Her childhood had been measured not in birthdays or school terms, but in the intervals between attacks. "You got to understand," she would tell a government investigator years later. "We wasn't raising children. We was raising soldiers." The feud had transformed the mountains into a landscape where childhood ended at first blood. Boys learned to shoot before they learned their letters, and girls memorized the family's hiding places the way other children learned nursery rhymes. Education meant knowing which ridgelines provided good cover, which hollows connected to safe territory, and which neighbors could be trusted with your life. Sarah Ellen's education began the night Levi Tolliver and his sons surrounded the schoolhouse during the Christmas pageant of 1881. 23 children were inside, along with their teacher and several mothers who had come to watch the program. When the shooting started, Sarah Ellen didn't scream or cry like the younger ones. She crawled under the pine plank floor through a loose board her father had shown her weeks earlier, slithered through the dirt and broken glass to the creek bank, and ran 2 miles through freezing darkness to bring help. "That night taught me something," she said later. "Ain't no such thing as innocence in a feud. You're either family or you're enemy, and if you're family, you better be ready to fight." The attack on the schoolhouse marked a turning point in the violence. Previously, both sides had maintained at least the pretense of honor, avoiding women and children when possible. But 3 years of killing had eroded such restraints. When survival was at stake, honor became a luxury few could afford. What would you do if your children's bedtime stories were warnings about which paths to avoid, which names never to speak aloud? if their lullabies were code words for different kinds of danger approaching through the darkness. The mountains were raising a generation that had never known peace. Children who measured time in ambushes and defined family by how many graves their surname could claim. They grew up hard and suspicious, trusting no one outside their immediate kin, viewing every stranger as a potential threat. And when those children came of age, they would prove more ruthless than their parents had ever imagined. Sheriff Daniel Morrison knew about the fresh grave behind the Tolliver cabin, just as he knew about the Combs boys who had been spotted, crossing the county line with blood on their clothes and murder in their eyes. He also knew that his own election depended on staying neutral in a war that had already claimed his predecessor, 2 deputies, and the county judge who had been foolish enough to issue warrants for both sides. The courthouse in Pikeville sat like an island of supposed civilization in an ocean of organized violence, its brick walls pocked with bullet holes from the night someone tried to assassinate Circuit Judge William Wright during a grand jury session. Wright had made the mistake of attempting to bring federal law to mountain justice, issuing indictments against 17 men from 4 different families. He lasted 6 months before a shotgun blast through his bedroom window convinced him to request a transfer to somewhere less hazardous, like the Indian Territory. From the Pike County Sheriff's Department incident log, November 3, 1883. Reports of gunfire near Coon Branch. Investigation delayed pending availability of adequate personnel. Suggest waiting until spring. Morrison had inherited the sheriff's badge from his uncle, who had died in office under circumstances the coroner charitably listed as accidental gunshot wound. The truth was simpler. Uncle Pete had tried to arrest Jeremiah Tolliver for cattle theft and learned that some laws were written in lead instead of ink. The lesson wasn't lost on his nephew. The courthouse crowd understood the arrangement. Justice came in 2 varieties: the kind that played out in courtrooms with lawyers and juries, reserved for disputes between civilized people, and the kind that settled accounts in midnight clearings with rifles and rope, which applied to everyone else. The feuding families existed in a legal twilight zone where warrants went unserved. Witnesses forgot what they had seen, and juries somehow failed to convict even when the evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't mere corruption, though plenty of that existed. It was a pragmatic recognition that formal law had no power in communities where men had been settling their own disputes since before the county existed. A sheriff who insisted on enforcing federal statutes against mountain families would find himself outnumbered, outgunned, and generally outlived by his more diplomatic successors. The system worked as long as the violence stayed contained within certain boundaries. Feuding families could kill each other with impunity, but they couldn't disrupt commerce, interfere with mail delivery, or threaten the railroad interests that were beginning to eye the region's coal deposits. When blood spilled beyond the hollers and onto the main roads, that's when outside authorities took notice. But for now, in the isolated valleys where surnames were battle flags and children learned to load rifles before they could tie their shoes, the law was whatever a man could enforce with his own hands and whatever allies he could muster when the shooting started. Martha Combs stood at her kitchen window on the morning of April 6, 1884, watching her 14-year-old son Timothy practice quick draw with his father's Colt revolver. Each pull of the trigger clicked on an empty chamber, but she flinched anyway, remembering the weight of her own infant daughter in her arms 5 years earlier when the shooting had started. That baby was 9 now, old enough to know why Mama kept a shotgun leaned against the butter churn and why Papa never walked to the barn without checking the ridgeline first. The women of the feuding families lived in a world apart from their men's war councils and midnight raids, yet they were often the ones who suffered its consequences most directly. While their husbands and sons planned ambushes and counted ammunition, the women buried the dead, tended the wounded, and raised the children who would inherit both the glory and the horror of the family's honor. They had their own networks, quieter but no less effective than the men's alliances. Information traveled along lines invisible to outsiders. Which family had suffered losses, which clan was planning retaliation, which children had been marked for revenge. A woman hanging laundry might signal warnings with the way she arranged her clothesline. A visit to trade preserves could carry intelligence about enemy movements. And when the shooting started, they knew which root cellars offered the best protection and which neighbors could be trusted with their lives. Martha had lost 2 brothers, a cousin, and her eldest son to the feud. She had also helped plan the ambush that killed Ezekiel Tolliver at his own wedding, coordinating with 3 other women to ensure their men would know exactly where and when to strike. Her hands had never pulled a trigger in anger, but they had loaded the rifles that ended 6 lives and prepared the bandages that saved 4 others. "People think women don't fight in feuds," she told her daughter years later. "They're wrong. We fight different, that's all. We fight longer, and we fight smarter." The women's war was psychological as much as physical. They remembered every slight, every funeral their families had been forced to attend, every child who had been orphaned by their enemies' guns. They passed these grievances down to their daughters like heirloom quilts, each generation adding new patterns of pain to the design. But they also remembered the costs. They had watched their communities tear themselves apart, seen neighbors become enemies, and children grow old before their time. Some of them began to whisper about peace, about finding ways to end the cycle before it consumed another generation. These conversations happened in gardens and kitchens, away from the men who measured their worth in enemy graves. Martha Combs was not one of those women. She had buried too many of her own to forgive, loved too deeply to forget. When her remaining son asked why they couldn't just move away, start over somewhere the Tolliver name had no power, she touched the locket that held her dead boy's hair and said, "Because honor ain't something you can pack in a wagon." Isaac Bentley's general store in downtown Pikeville sold everything a mountain family might need to survive. Flour and coffee, patent medicines and yard goods, farm tools and household supplies. But his most profitable inventory was kept in the back room, behind a locked door that opened only for customers who knew the right words and had the right connections. Winchester rifles, Colt revolvers, ammunition by the case, and dynamite by the stick. Bentley had been supplying both sides of the feud for 3 years, a careful balancing act that required equal measures of diplomacy and moral blindness. When Samuel Combs needed rifles for his cousins, Bentley provided them. When Levi Tolliver required dynamite for purposes unspecified, Bentley asked no questions and kept no records that might interest federal investigators. The economics of feuding created their own marketplace. Families at war needed weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, and reliable information about their enemies' movements. They needed trusted intermediaries who could facilitate communication between opposing sides when temporary truces were necessary, and they needed suppliers who understood that discretion was worth paying extra for. From Bentley's private ledger, May 22, 1884. S. Combs, 12 boxes, 44 to 40, 2 gallons laudanum, 50 feet hemp rope, terms net 30, payment in gold or equivalent livestock. The equivalent livestock often consisted of cattle that had wandered away from Tolliver property, found their way to Combs pastures, and somehow lost their original brands in the process. Bentley didn't inquire too closely about such transactions. Business was business. and the feuding families were reliable customers who paid their debts and didn't haggle over prices. Other merchants throughout eastern Kentucky had discovered similar opportunities. Dr. Marcus Webb made more money treating gunshot wounds than delivering babies. Jeremiah Potter's blacksmith shop did a thriving business in horseshoe nails that could double as rifle sights and farm implements that bore suspicious resemblances to weapons of war. And the Railroad Express office handled packages marked farm equipment that rattled with the unmistakable sound of ammunition. The outside world was slowly discovering the mountain's rich coal deposits, and the companies that would soon transform the region were already establishing their own networks of influence. They needed the cooperation of local families, which meant staying neutral in existing conflicts, while quietly supporting whichever side could guarantee the most favorable terms when the time came to start mining. But for now, the feuds were simply another business opportunity in a region where few opportunities existed. The merchants who supplied, the warring families grew prosperous, the undertakers stayed busy, and everyone pretended not to notice that their community was eating itself alive one bullet at a time. Reverend Nathaniel Cross had been preaching in the mountains for 8 years when the Combs-Tolliver feud reached his doorstep, and he had learned that salvation took different forms depending on which holler you happened to be visiting that particular Sunday. At the Mount Olive Baptist Church, where the Combs family held the front pews and contributed most of the building fund, he preached about righteous vengeance and the wages of sin. At the New Hope Methodist Chapel, where Tollivers and their allies gathered, he emphasized forgiveness and turning the other cheek. The contradiction troubled him less than it should have. Survival in mountain ministry required flexibility, and Cross had discovered that theological principles were luxuries few could afford when Sunday service might be interrupted by gunfire, and the offering plate had to compete with ammunition costs for the congregation's limited resources. He had performed 17 funerals since the feud began, including 3 on the same day after an ambush near Devil's Creek had left bodies scattered across a quarter-mile of creek bottom. He had also officiated at 6 weddings, each one a potential target for enemy action, and each one requiring armed guards disguised as groomsmen. The line between sacred and secular had blurred until Cross could no longer distinguish between defending the faith and defending the faithful. On June 14, 1884, that distinction became irrelevant. Cross was conducting evening services at Mount Olive when someone spotted riders approaching through the timber. The congregation had rehearsed this scenario. Women and children to the root cellar behind the altar, men to the windows with whatever weapons they had brought. The reverend was supposed to take cover with the non-combatants and pray for deliverance. Instead, Cross picked up the shotgun he kept behind the pulpit and took position at the front door. "The Lord helps them that help themselves," he announced to his startled congregation, racking a shell into the chamber. "And right now, the Lord wants us to send some Tollivers to meet their Maker." The battle lasted 40 minutes and left 3 men dead in the churchyard. Cross accounted for one of them personally, dropping Jeremiah Tolliver with both barrels at close range while the man was trying to force his way through the sanctuary door. It was the first time the preacher had killed anyone, but it wouldn't be the last. The church board met the following week to discuss their minister's conduct. The debate lasted 5 minutes. "Preacher done what needed doing," declared Isaiah Combs, the congregation's senior deacon. "Bible says there's a time to kill and a time to heal. Killing time ain't over yet." Cross hung up his clerical collar that day and picked up a rifle instead. If God wanted peace in the mountains, he would have to send better negotiators. Until then, the Reverend would serve both Christ and the Combs family with equal devotion, trusting that the Almighty would sort out the theological complications in his own good time. His decision shocked the Methodist Conference and delighted the Combs clan, who had gained a spiritual advisor with both heavenly connections and earthly firepower. But it also marked another step in the feud's evolution from family dispute to religious war, with each side claiming divine sanction for their particular brand of justice. The postal inspector's report lay unread on somebody's desk in Washington, D.C., filed between complaints about mail theft in the Dakota Territory and a dispute over postal routes in Oregon. 27 pages of testimony, maps, and death certificates that documented the complete breakdown of federal mail service across 3 counties in eastern Kentucky, where postal workers had taken to carrying rifles and mail coaches required armed escorts to complete their routes. Inspector Charles Hammond had spent 2 months in the mountains during the summer of 1884, attempting to determine why mail delivery had become so irregular in the region. What he discovered was a postal system held hostage by feuding families who intercepted communications, threatened mail carriers, and used the post office as an intelligence center for tracking their enemies' activities. From Hammond's confidential report, August 15, 1884. Mail delivery in Pike, Floyd, and Knott counties has deteriorated to the point of complete dysfunction. Carriers report being stopped and searched by armed men, mail bags are routinely opened and correspondence examined, and several postal workers have been threatened with death for delivering letters to particular families. Recommend immediate suspension of service pending military intervention. The mail had become another casualty of war. Letters between family members were intercepted and read for intelligence about troop movements and planning. Government correspondence was examined for evidence of outside interference. Love letters became death sentences when they revealed romantic connections between enemy families, and the post office itself was transformed from a neutral meeting ground into contested territory where sorting mail required the same caution as crossing a battlefield. Hammond had interviewed 17 postal workers, 12 mail carriers, and 4 postmasters during his investigation. Their stories revealed a postal system that had adapted to survive in a landscape where federal authority meant nothing and family loyalty meant everything. Routes were planned around recent violence. Delivery schedules were coordinated with local intelligence networks, and the mail got through only when all parties agreed to let it pass. Some families had established their own communication systems, using hunters, traders, and kinfolk to carry messages between allied households. Others relied on coded newspaper advertisements and messages hidden in legitimate commercial correspondence. The post office remained operational, but it served the feuding families rather than the federal government that nominally controlled it. The inspector's recommendation for military intervention was filed away and forgotten, lost in the bureaucratic maze of a government that had bigger problems than mail delivery in the Kentucky mountains. The Civil War had ended, but Reconstruction was failing. Indian wars were raging across the West, and Congress had little appetite for another military adventure in territory that most politicians couldn't find on a map. So the mail continued to move through the mountains at the pleasure of men who measured their authority in rifle sights rather than postal regulations. And the federal government pretended not to notice that entire counties had effectively seceded from the Union without bothering to file the proper paperwork. The meeting took place in neutral territory, a limestone cave system 15 miles from any settlement, reached only by paths known to hunters and men with reason to avoid public roads. Flickering torchlight revealed faces that hadn't shared the same space in 5 years without shooting at each other. Samuel Combs and Levi Tolliver, along with representatives from 6 other feuding families whose wars had spread like wildfire across the mountain counties. They had come together because something larger was threatening their traditional way of life. Railroad companies backed by Northern capital were surveying the mountains for coal deposits, bringing with them their own armies of security guards and their own ideas about law and order. The feuding families might kill each other with regularity, but they were united in their opposition to outside interference in mountain affairs. "They want to turn us into company towns," declared William Anderson, whose family had been feuding with the Hatfields for a generation. "Make us into wage slaves working their mines, living in their houses, buying from their stores. Time we stopped killing each other and started killing the real enemy." The alliance that emerged from that cave meeting would have profound consequences for the region. 7 families representing over 300 armed men agreed to a temporary truce that would allow them to coordinate their resistance to outside economic interests. Their wars would continue, but they would be conducted according to new rules that ensured the feuding families could present a united front against common threats. The compact they signed was written on parchment made from deer hide and sealed with blood from each family's senior patriarch. It established protocols for communication between enemy clans, procedures for settling disputes without violence during periods of external threat, and mechanisms for coordinating military action against outside forces. But the alliance also revealed how thoroughly the feuding had militarized mountain society. These weren't farmers with hunting rifles anymore. They were organized guerrilla forces with command structures, intelligence networks, and strategic planning capabilities that would have impressed regular army officers. The years of fighting each other had turned them into formidable opponents for anyone foolish enough to threaten their independence. October 11th, 1884. Agreement between the united families for mutual defense against foreign interference in mountain affairs, sealed in blood and sworn before God. The cave meeting marked the beginning of the mountains' transition from isolated feudal society to organized resistance movement. The families would continue killing each other, but they would do it on their own terms, without interference from railroad companies, federal marshals, or anyone else who mistook mountain justice for simple lawlessness. Within weeks, survey teams found their instruments destroyed, their camps burned, and their guards missing. Coal company executives discovered that their local contacts had suddenly developed selective amnesia about property boundaries and mineral rights. The outside world was getting its first taste of what happened when mountain families stopped fighting each other and started fighting together. Marcus Dalton wore a tailored suit that cost more than most mountain families earned in a year, and he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone who couldn't be bought, threatened, or replaced. As chief security officer for Consolidated Coal and Iron Company, he had broken strikes in Pennsylvania, cleared claim jumpers in Colorado, and pacified mining camps from West Virginia to Wyoming. The Kentucky mountains would be just another brief assignment on his way to a corner office and a pension. He arrived in Pikeville on November 3, 1884, with 20 hired guns and a briefcase full of surveying reports that proved his company owned mineral rights to 17,000 acres of mountain land. Local law enforcement had been contacted. Appropriate bribes had been distributed. Everything was arranged according to the methods that had worked everywhere else. Consolidated had expanded its operations. What Dalton didn't understand was that he was walking into a war zone where the normal rules of business had been suspended for the past 5 years. The local sheriff who had accepted his company's money was afraid to leave town without an armed escort. The county judge who had promised cooperation was hiding in Lexington after someone shot out his office windows. And the feuding families who were supposed to be too busy killing each other to oppose outside development had just agreed to a temporary truce that made them infinitely more dangerous than any mine strike he had ever broken. The first survey team disappeared on November 7th. Dalton sent out search parties, which also vanished without a trace. When the company's local foreman tried to recruit replacement workers from the mountain communities, he discovered that no one was available for hire at any price. Even families that weren't directly involved in the feuding had somehow become unavailable for employment. From Dalton's field reports, November 15, 1884. Local population appears to be coordinating resistance efforts. Recommend immediate reinforcement with additional security personnel and consideration of military intervention under federal mining statutes. The company had prepared for individual resistance from property owners. They had legal precedents for dealing with squatters, procedures for handling claim jumpers, and established methods for convincing reluctant landowners to accept reasonable buyout offers. What they hadn't anticipated was organized guerrilla warfare conducted by families who had spent 5 years perfecting the art of killing from ambush. Dalton's second wave of reinforcements lasted 2 weeks before retreating to the relative safety of the county seat, where they discovered that the feuding family's intelligence network extended into every store, saloon, and boarding house in town. Their movements were tracked, their conversations overheard, and their plans known almost before they made them. The mountain families had turned their traditional skills against a new enemy. Men who could track a deer through miles of wilderness had no trouble following company surveyors. Women who had hidden weapons and supplies from feuding enemies proved equally adept at concealing evidence of their family's resistance activities. Children who had grown up dodging bullets made excellent couriers for carrying messages between allied families. By December, Consolidated Coal and Iron had lost 11 men, $40,000 in equipment, and most of their enthusiasm for immediate development of Kentucky mountain properties. The feuding families had discovered that their enemies didn't all live in neighboring hollers. Some of them wore suits and carried briefcases, but they died just as easily when someone who knew the mountains decided they needed killing. Deputy U.S. Marshal William Eversole rode into Floyd County on January 9, 1885, carrying federal warrants for the arrest of 17 men whose only crime was being too successful at mountain justice. The warrants had been issued at the request of Consolidated Coal and Iron Company, which had finally admitted they couldn't handle the situation with private security forces and had called upon the federal government to restore order to the region. Eversole was a veteran law enforcement officer who had served in Indian Territory and the Dakota Badlands, places where federal authority was measured in rifle shots, and men died for wearing the wrong badge in the wrong place. He understood mountain culture well enough to know that his warrants were essentially death sentences for anyone foolish enough to try serving them. But he also understood that federal law was supposed to mean something, even in places where local law had broken down completely. He made it 17 miles into the mountains before vanishing as completely as if the earth had opened and swallowed him whole. His horse was found 3 days later, grazing peacefully in a meadow beside Rockhouse Creek. His badge was discovered nailed to a tree along the main road into Pikeville, accompanied by a note that federal investigators would later classify as too inflammatory to include in their official reports. The disappearance triggered the largest federal investigation in the region's history. A full company of federal marshals was dispatched to search for Eversole and serve the outstanding warrants. They found a landscape that had been systematically prepared for guerrilla warfare. Bridges destroyed, roads blocked, and every house, barn, and cabin apparently abandoned by families who had melted into the mountains like smoke. From the Federal Investigation Report, February 21, 1885. Subject area appears to have been evacuated of all civilian population. No resistance encountered, but no cooperation obtained. Search efforts hampered by difficult terrain and complete absence of local intelligence. The marshals spent 6 weeks in the mountains without making a single arrest, or finding any trace of their missing colleague. They did discover evidence of extensive military-style organization among the feuding families, supply caches hidden in natural caves, observation posts that commanded all the major routes into the region, and communication networks that allowed information to travel faster than their own mounted patrols. What they didn't find was anyone willing to admit knowing anything about federal warrants, coal company operations, or the whereabouts of Deputy Marshal Eversole. The mountain families had simply disappeared, taking their secrets with them into hiding places that had been prepared and provisioned for exactly this kind of emergency. The investigation was quietly terminated after 2 more marshals were wounded in separate ambush attacks. Federal authorities concluded that the region was too dangerous for continued law enforcement operations and recommended that military occupation would be necessary to establish effective federal control. Since Congress had no appetite for occupying American territory with federal troops, the recommendation was filed away and forgotten. Eversole's fate remained a mystery. Some said he had been killed and buried in an unmarked grave deep in the mountains. Others claimed he had been taken prisoner and was being held until the federal government agreed to withdraw all warrants and cease interfering in mountain affairs. A few whispered that he had gone native, abandoned his badge, and joined one of the feuding families. The truth was simpler and more disturbing. He had been disappeared so thoroughly that he might never have existed at all. The explosion that shattered the pre-dawn silence on March the 17th, 1885, could be heard 20 miles away. A thunderclap that rolled through the hollers and announced that the mountain wars had entered a new phase. What had been Consolidated Coal and Iron Company's main equipment depot was now a crater filled with twisted metal and burning timbers, while fragments of survey equipment and payroll records drifted down like deadly snow. The attack had been coordinated with military precision. 7 families, temporarily unified against their common enemy, had struck simultaneously at targets across 3 counties. Coal company offices burned in Pikeville, Prestonsburg, and Hazard. Survey teams that had been working under armed guard simply vanished, along with their guards and all their equipment. And Marcus Dalton, the security chief who had arrived 6 months earlier with such confidence in his company's methods, was found hanging from a railroad trestle with a sign around his neck that read, "This is what happens to thieves." The mountain families had discovered that their traditional methods of warfare translated remarkably well to corporate targets. Companies that tried to buy their land found their local agents eliminated with the same efficiency that feuding families had been eliminating each other. Survey teams that mapped their mineral resources were hunted with the same skills that mountain men had used to track deer and enemy kinfolk. And corporate executives who thought they could intimidate people who had been killing each other for generations learned that there were worse things than feuding neighbors to worry about. The war against outside interests had united the families in ways that decades of peace negotiations had never achieved. Samuel Combs and Levi Tolliver, who had been trying to kill each other for 6 years, now coordinated their attacks with the efficiency of seasoned military partners. Their children, who had grown up knowing which surnames were enemy names, learned to recognize new enemies who wore suits instead of overalls, but died just as easily when mountain justice caught up with them. From a recovered company telegraph, March 18, 1885. All operations suspended immediately. Withdrawal complete by month's end. Do not repeat, do not send additional personnel. Local situation beyond company capabilities. The defeat of Consolidated Coal and Iron sent a message throughout the corporate world. The mountains were not ready for outside development. Other companies quietly shelved their expansion plans for the region. federal authorities decided that the area was too volatile for immediate attention, and the feuding families discovered that their greatest victory had come not from killing each other, but from joining forces against enemies who threatened everything they held sacred. But victory came with a price. The families had revealed the full extent of their military capabilities to federal investigators, who filed detailed reports about their organization, tactics, and leadership. They had also demonstrated that mountain justice could reach far beyond traditional boundaries, striking at targets in state capitals and corporate boardrooms with equal effectiveness. The outside world would remember this lesson. When they returned, they would come prepared for the kind of resistance that had destroyed consolidated coal and iron. And next time, they would bring enough force to ensure that mountain justice would finally submit to federal law. The last shot of the Combs-Tolliver feud was fired on August 9, 1888, at 3:17 in the afternoon, when 70-year-old Jacob Tolliver spotted Samuel Combs's grandson walking along the ridge above Sourwood Branch and decided that some debts were inherited, along with family names. The boy died instantly, never knowing why his surname had made him a target, or understanding that his death marked the end of a war that had consumed 3 generations. By then, 47 people had died in the fighting. Entire bloodlines had been exterminated. Children had grown to adulthood without ever meeting some of their cousins, who lived on the wrong side of invisible battle lines that divided the mountains into armed territories. And the communities that had once shared common churches, schools, and markets had fractured into isolated camps where trust ended at the boundaries of immediate family. The silence that followed was more disturbing than the violence had been. For 9 years, the sound of gunfire had been as common as birdsong in the hollers. Families had organized their lives around the rhythms of warfare, planting crops between raids, timing weddings to avoid ambush seasons, raising children who knew the difference between hunting shots and killing shots before they could read their own names. When the shooting finally stopped, it left behind a landscape scarred by more than just bullets. The social fabric that had held mountain communities together for generations had been shredded by years of mutual slaughter. Neighbors who had once helped each other through hard winters now crossed the road to avoid speaking. Churches that had served multiple families were abandoned or burned. Schools closed when parents couldn't agree on which children could safely attend together. From the Pike County Coroner's records, final entry: Jacob Tolliver, age 16, gunshot wound to the head. Manner of death, homicide. Investigation closed due to lack of cooperative witnesses. The ending came not through negotiation or formal peace treaties, but through simple exhaustion. Both families had bled themselves white, losing so many members that continuing the feud became practically impossible. The survivors were mostly women, children, and elderly men who lacked the strength for further warfare. The young men who might have carried the fight into another generation were lying in mountain cemeteries marked with stones that bore only initials, their names too dangerous to carve in permanent monuments. But the silence was also pregnant with future violence. The children who had grown up during the feuding carried their families' grievances like genetic defects, inherited hatreds that would shape their own relationships and define their own understanding of justice. Some would move away, seeking lives uncontaminated by their family's bloody history. Others would stay, keeping the old resentments alive through stories told in whispers and grudges nursed like sacred flames. The mountains had learned to kill, and that knowledge wouldn't easily be forgotten. The techniques, the traditions, and the terrible logic of blood vengeance had been passed down like heirloom weapons, ready to be taken up again whenever honor demanded satisfaction and law proved insufficient. Reverend Nathaniel Cross, who had traded his clerical collar for a rifle 8 years earlier, put away his weapons on December 25, 1888, and returned to the pulpit at Mount Olive Baptist Church to deliver a Christmas sermon to a congregation that included 17 widows, 23 orphans, and 6 men who had survived the feuding through a combination of luck, skill, and strategic cowardice. His text was from Ezekiel. Can these bones live? It was a question that haunted every family gathering, every church service, every community meeting where empty chairs outnumbered occupied ones. The mountains had sacrificed their young men to honor, their children to inherited hatred, and their future to the demands of avenging the past. The cemetery behind Mount Olive told the story more clearly than any newspaper account or government investigation. Row after row of graves marked only with carved initials and dates, their occupants too controversial to name even in death. Some graves held multiple bodies, victims of ambushes that had wiped out entire raiding parties. Others contained children who had died for carrying the wrong surname to the wrong place at the wrong time. The economics of feuding had impoverished more than just individual families. Entire communities had declined as young men died instead of marrying, starting businesses, or raising the next generation. Farms lay abandoned because their owners had been killed and their heirs had fled to safer territory. Schools closed when teachers refused to work in areas where education could be interrupted by gunfire and students might not survive to graduation. Tourism to the region dropped to zero as word spread that the Kentucky mountains were too dangerous for visitors. Investment capital dried up as companies discovered that their representatives had an alarming tendency to disappear. And federal aid programs avoided the area entirely, their administrators reluctant to send personnel into territory where federal authority had proven ineffective against local justice. Cross's Christmas sermon lasted 27 minutes and ended with a challenge that would echo through the mountains for decades. We have learned to kill. Now we must learn to live. But learning to live proved more difficult than learning to kill. The habits of warfare once acquired were hard to break. Families continued to arm their children and teach them to shoot. Neighbors maintained their suspicious vigilance, and the old feuds simmered beneath the surface of forced civility, ready to reignite whenever new grievances arose to feed old flames. The outside world had written off the mountains as too violent, too backward, and too dangerous for civilized development. That judgment would persist for another generation, leaving the region isolated and impoverished, while other areas of Kentucky modernized and prospered. The price of honor had been paid in more than just blood.